My name is Nico Whedon, and I am the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement here at the museum. I recognize a lot of you. Hi. So Studio Salon is the museum's literary society that explores the dynamic intersections between literature and contemporary art. So for this very special edition of Studio Salon, we celebrate the launch of South of Pico, African-American artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, an exploration of the vibrant art scene in Southern California in the face of the tumultuous political environment of those decades. We are so thrilled to have author, curator, professor, Dr. Kellie Jones here with us tonight to celebrate not only her genius and contributions to the field with this book and many other publications, but also her longstanding relationship with this museum and the broad network of artists and scholars and museum professionals that we share. So today, Dr. Jones will be joined by 2014-2015 artist-in-residence Sadie Barnette and Ashley James, MoMA Research Consortium Fellow in the Department of Drawings and Prints, as they discuss migration, mobility, and the future of Black-owned contemporary art spaces. So because I'm eager to kind of dive right in here, I will not list the many, many, many accolades that are kind of shared across the stage here, and we'll ask you all to refer to your printed program that you should have in your hands. So my first thank you is for the three of you for agreeing to be here tonight to guide us in conversation. So please join me in welcoming them. Right. I would also like to thank Adize Wilford, who is the Studio Museum MoMA Curatorial Fellow, who organized the exhibition Excerpt, in which Sadie is an exhibiting artist, and Henry Murphy, Studio Museum MoMA Public Programs Fellow, who coordinated this evening's program. Can you both give us a wave so we can see you out there? Thank you, guys. And of course, thank you all for being here tonight to join in the celebration with us. So following what will be roughly an hour-long discussion amongst our panelists, there'll be a question and answer segment, so please hold on to your questions until the end. And we're gonna leave ample time for you to purchase your own signed copy of South of Pico from the museum store upstairs. And kind of finish up those snacks in the back. So also, given the architecture of the space, you'll actually have to walk by Sadie's work on the way out. So I encourage you to go up and see it up close and personal and just see how amazing it is. So yeah, that's kind of enough for me. I think I'm really excited to see how, like this program series, Excerpt as an exhibition explores the intersections of literature and contemporary art. So I will now pass the microphone over to our panel.
Thank you. This is on, right? Okay, I am Ashley James. I wrote a little bit of an introduction for a bit of context for South of Pico, and from there I have some questions that I prepared for Dr. Jones and Sadie. It's a little long, but it's an important book, so bear with me. The introduction to Dr. Kellie Jones' South of Pico, African-American artist in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, quite elegantly opens with an anecdote involving former librarian and art collector Miriam Matthews, who as of July 13th, 1966, is following up about a commission she's initiated with the painter and draftsman Charles White, a portrait of the former slave and pioneer Biddy Mason. And here is that letter from the Smithsonian Archives. Of American art that Matthews sent to White that summer, where she writes, "When I visited your studio last fall to ask you to do an original study of Biddy Mason, I gave you a brief sketch of her life. I am enclosing a duplicate copy since you may have misplaced the first one." Which is a bit of a nudge to get going. She settles the specifics of payment and then closes, "I hope you and your family are well." She also includes this image. 1 year later, now a quite satisfied customer having received her image, Matthews follows up. "I am delighted with the Biddy Mason portrait," she exclaims. "She has poise, dignity, and strength of character, and beauty that comes from within," dated July 30th, 1967. This Matthews-White exchange is but one among very many archival ahas to come in South of Pico, which is chock full of them. But it is of a special interest here in a summation of this groundbreaking text because, for the precise reason I imagine Professor Jones chose the anecdote as book opener, it draws together the myriad conceptual threads that she pursues in her seminal study, South of Pico, including but not limited to self-image and object making against the backdrop of Black historical erasure and or distortion, the forging of artists' archivist, activist communities, which includes alternative circuits of patronage, cum, approbation, the importance of the transmission of history to African American artists at this time, often via autodidactic routes, and the often unspoken impact of Black women in particular in facilitating these aesthetic exchanges and transmissions. And yet more, this art commission initiates what is one of the most keen and crucial arguments that Professor Jones stages in and through South of Pico, which is that the self-forged spaces, networks, publications, communities, relationships, both friendly and familial, that give rise to these works of art in ways both direct and indirect, are as important to an art history as the works themselves. The South of Pico is a seamless commingling of deft, formal, and theoretical analysis of objects and deeply researched contextual historical writing on Black career and institution building, which is another way of saying that, quite simply, you can't know a work of art if no one first worked for it to be seen, so one must write that art history as well. To this end, across 4 chapters, Emerge, Claim, Organize, and In Motion, Professor Jones tracks the innovative emergent practices of Black artists in Los Angeles at the height of Black power, with one eye towards medium and the other toward the material conditions of artists' self-making and display. So in chapters 2 and 4, Professor Jones highlights the primary practices, mediums, or genres that define the time. So in chapter Claim, Jones centers assemblage as pioneered by Noah Purifoy, John Uterbridge, and Betty Saar, which is the slide we see here. And in chapter 4, In Motion, she focuses on what she calls post-minimal ephemerality and performance, with the Sangan Ngudi, Houston Conwell, David Hammonds, and Marion Hassinger serving as a featured artist in that chapter. Professor Jones then couples these deep theoretical insights and strong, generous, close reads with the equally thorough, archivally rich chapters of 1 and 3, which attend to the ways in which Black artists made, or perhaps willed, which is a key word for her here, themselves and their friends into art world visibility. Thus, in the first chapter, Emerge, Charles White, Betty Saar, Melvin Edwards stand as galvanizing case studies of Black artist success at a time when the roles of Black professionals, both aesthetic and otherwise, were severely circumscribed under the effects of de facto segregation. And in chapter 3, Organize, Professor Jones enumerates many ways in which artists inevitably took matters into their own hands, just building the damn things themselves through galleries and self-publishing. In chapter 3 in particular, we find the less well-known until now with this book, West Coast counterpoints to the more well-known East Coast instances of Black artist self-making, of which the institution we gather in tonight, the Studio Museum, is one, founded in 1968 with the goals of presentation and preservation of art by artists of African descent, along with a particular commitment to the cultivation and support of emerging artists via the studio residency program. Established the same year, also in '68 on the West Coast, is Suzanne Jackson's Gallery 32, which among a range of exhibitions across its some 2-year span, held an Emory Douglas solo show where the artist featured his images of Black Panthers done in pastel, which was another one of those archival aha moments, in 1969. And I call attention to that exhibition in particular, both because Jones tells us that it is the best attended of all the shows held at 32, which is remarkable, but also because it helpfully draws us forward to a contemporary artist like Sadie Barnette, who is a former artist in residence right here at the Studio Museum, reared in Oakland and now based in LA, and whose work relies heavily on Black historical archives, particularly those of her father. Barnett is perhaps uniquely tied up in this California Black aesthetic and political history. Professor Jones's approach to Black Los Angeles art history is most forcefully reflected in the fact that she specifically visions the study through the lens of migration as the very context by which we can even begin to understand Black LA objects. Thus, we are given an expansive introduction that takes us back not only to the Great Migration, but further still to the 19th century postbellum context of the enslaved Biddy Mason who heads west, eventually petitioning her way to freedom. So another way one might articulate this point about the importance of historical context is to say that if you can't know a work of art, if no one first worked for it to be displayed, then perhaps you can't know an LA artist's work if you don't understand the how and why they came to LA in the first place. And Professor Jones asks why and to what end, and with what dreams, even if deferred. So migration is concept and content, theory and material, and attending to that is not just a matter of academic rigor, but also one of ethics. What this all adds up to is a book that is as rich in aesthetic analysis, the stuff of close looking, of inspections and dimensions, of color and texture, as it is in archival bounty. So I'd like to close here by emphasizing once more what is the great vision and labor of South of Pico. As more and more of these late 60s, 70s artists on which Professor Jones has shown light, makes their way into the art historical mainstream, I almost wonder if there is a way in which we're slowly losing sight of the seams. Names are more familiar now than ever, and these aha moments start reading less like surprise and more like flashes of recognition. So right now there is a Bill T. Williams show at the Rosenfeld Gallery. A Howardina Pindell retrospective opens up at MCA Chicago next year. At the Brooklyn Museum, of course, is Black Radical Women, which features many, if not all, of the women artists in this book. And I also have the pleasure of assisting Esther Adler, assistant curator in Johnson Prince at MoMA, on a forthcoming Charles White retrospective, research for which brought those Marian Matthews letter to my attention. So all of this starts to formalize into a history that is in some ways becoming self-evident canonized. But of course, the look of effortlessness most often belies great labor, which is to say, there is no Biddy Mason history if a woman didn't trek across the nation quite literally in pursuit of her freedom. There is no Biddy Mason portrait if a Black librarian didn't seek out the man who would go on to complete it with poise and dignity and strength of character. No portrait if an artist didn't spend evenings in a studio poring over his paper, thinking about the light. There is no record if a gallery, or perhaps even a bank, didn't make space on their walls for viewing. No record if a wife never sent the letters to an archive that accessions them for researchers. And finally, why we are here today, there is no Los Angeles African American art history if a scholar didn't crisscross the nation over the course of years, poured through archives, scheduled, prepared, conducted interviews in person and by phone, transcribed pages after pages of oral histories, up until then untold, looked closely, spent time, thought deeply, scoured for sources that could offer up other avenues of illumination, curated exhibitions that would revitalize careers and spawn 1,000 dissertations, including my own, then sat down at her desk to write it all down for us to have as one, a comprehensive history. So if not on any other day than one of celebration for this book, Professor Jones, praise and thank you for a tremendous pioneering accomplishment of intelligence, labor, and great, great care. So thank you. It's a marvelous, marvelous book, and we should begin. I thought that we could just follow the structure of your book as a way to structure questions. So I thought let's start with your second chapter, Claim, where you sketch out the contours of assemblage as, I think, a key artistic strategy of this time. Could you talk a bit about the importance, what you see as the importance of assemblage during this moment, and perhaps the different ways we see it practiced through the examples that you provide? And Sadie, though you don't use a precise term to describe your practice, we might think of an adjacent one, collage. So can you speak about your interest in collage and perhaps the practitioners that serve as examples for you?
Well, thank you for that great introduction. It's very humbling, but I did do all that. You're right. And it makes me tired, but it was fun too. Assemblage. Well, assemblage was really, it's really been around for thousands of years. As I also say in the book, when you look at collage and people in Japan in early centuries, pasting paper together and writing on it, you're starting with collage and assemblage. So, these practices have been around for a long time. Also, a lot of times, even in the West, used by folk artists. So they're people who have very weak authorship, as they say, so that, mainstream artists, the West, can come and capture these forms and say, look, this is new, with Picasso or Barak or others, or with Robert Rauschenberg in the 50s. In the 50s, that way of making in the United States became very apparent on the East and West Coast. So you have Robert Rauschenberg's combines, you have people like Kienholz on the West Coast. And then I think one of the signature things about African American artists using assemblage on the West Coast was certainly the Watts Rebel and or Ford's work, where he's the director of the Watts Towers Art Center. Watts rebels, things are burned down, things are trashed, and he decides to think about using those remains and the detritus to make art and to actually have a whole sculpture show and then a whole show exhibition that is around that, and it turns into an exhibition called 66 Signs of Neon. And so it became a way to think about the efficacy of Black rebellion as a material for art. And so that was No Purfoy's way. And Betty Saar really, as you mentioned, focused on 3 artists in that moment. Betty Saar really focuses on spirituality and building altars, like this one you see here. And before that, she's doing boxes. She's not really interested in the detritus of the rebellion, although that moment, politics of it, are important to her, and she makes Black Girl's Window, which is now at MoMA. And then John Otterbridge is really thinking about home place, the type of ways people use material in the South, where he's from, North Carolina, and thinking about translating those things into art. So there's, as I've narrated Black people in LA working with assemblage, in these 3 case studies kind of come into it from slightly different formations, but it's also important to note that it was a major art style of its time.
Well, I would also like to thank you for this amazing contribution. It was really impactful for me to read this history and sort of traverse so many locations that have been important to me, from Compton to Cal Arts to Berkeley. And I think in particular in that chapter really served as a sort of unweaving of a language that, was sort of born into this like collective language that we now have because these artists materialized it for us, but that I can't really imagine not having. So to read it in this way really sort of, retraced everything, and I guess to, unravel it is the best way that I can say it, because, to me, I can't really imagine looking at objects before David Hammond's, right? Because I'm born in 1984. So to me, it exists in this sort of unquestioned way, but when you look at the steps that it took to get there, it really helps me see the roots in my work. I guess to me, it's usually the found object and the power that has to really illuminate the context, which is another thing that's really central in the book, is allowing how artists would allow context to sort of be its own character or author or container for these social ideas and art ideas that are happening. I think that's one reason I use the found objects a lot. And the idea of collage or cutting or layering also to me is something that comes out of like a hip hop sensibility of sampling and sort of mashing up and repurposing, not recreating. But like there's so much out there. Maybe the way to make the most sense of it is not to create something new, but to reformat what we're already dealing with.
Yes. And that takes me to my next question, which is the status of history in your work, and if you could talk a little bit about your interest in the archive and your father's archive in particular. And Professor Jones, if you can speak about what is a very strong point made in the assemblage chapter, which is the importance of history looking back for Black artists at a time when that would be deemed nostalgic and not modern. So what it means for this, what you call an obsession with history, really, for Black artists at that time, and what the archive offers you right now.
Yeah, so the current project that I'm working on that you mentioned has to do with a personal archive, which is 500 pages of FBI documents surveilling my father and his time with the Black Panthers. He founded the Compton chapter of the Black Panthers and was involved just for about a year, and then left and worked on Angela Davis's campaign and was continued to be followed by the FBI. And that archive has really been an odd blending of family tree and government surveillance in one. So it can't really, separate the archive from the personal family experience. But I guess that's sort of the point, right? Is that these things aren't separate. Like the notion of home and the hard-won fights. I think that's something that really came to me. Even the idea of nostalgia is sort of like would be this privilege that we didn't necessarily have but had to fight for. Not like this relaxed, meandering down memory lane, but like a scraping together of
recuperative.
Yeah, we didn't even have birth certificates, right? So like to have dates, names of your family is something that's like a luxury, right? If you're descendants of slaves. It's sort of getting me to another point, so I'll wait on that.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, this whole idea, especially artists, the artists of the kind of what I call the front runners in Now Take This, but also, the people in the first chapter, Charles White, Melvin Edwards, but also Betty Saar. I mean, and particularly we see it in Charles White, the obsession with history, because we kind of take it for granted. Even those of us who are professors in school, those of us who go to school, understand that you can find classes on African American history, but you have to imagine a time where people had to find it themselves, and some place like the Schomburg, of course, being so instrumental in that, and in librarians discussing how people, went through books because they were so hungry for this knowledge that they had to keep replacing these things because people were just, not that they were disappearing, it's not like they said they were stealing them, they were really reading them, So there's that kind of impetus that I think goes really even throughout the book, throughout all these artists, even though you see people like Maren Hassinger and Senga Ngugi and David Hammonds approaching it from something different, from a different perspective. If you look at a portrait of Biddy Mason by Charles White to David Hammond's hair sculpture, I mean, there's a lot in between that, but there's still, I think, some of the same impetus in that. And just a side note, interesting when you say your dad worked on the Angela Davis campaign, as I'm sure many people did. So did Charles White, right? So the cover of the Now Dig This catalog, that show I did, is that work that he did for that campaign, which was a mailer. So that was another interesting kind of confluence there between these things. But yeah, certainly I think, these artists in one way or another look to think about history, think about their past, again, not as nostalgia, but as something that you had to have, you had to make up. and some things where the record is missing, kind of creating things in that space where it's missing. I think some of these, assemblages can also serve that purpose as well.
Definitely, and one of the really fascinating things that comes out of that chapter is that we learned that Betty Saar used actual material from her own family members in her collages in Grandma's house, which I used to have a slide for, but, and you write, in boxes such as Grandma's house and Grandma's garden, Saar incorporated pieces of glass and beads, things she might have found digging in Grandma Dro's yard. The difference with the family-oriented assemblages and collages is that Saar uses actual materials that were theirs. This is particularly true in the Aunt Hattie series, and it does make a difference. And I'm wondering if you can speak about that difference, that the use of actual used material, and was that practice unique to Saar, or is that something that you see in other artists from the time as well? And then Sadie, I'm curious too if you actually use primary source material, like the actual physical documents in your work, and if you have, what are the reasons for doing so or not doing so? If it adds something different. I'm sure it does, if it would, but yeah.
Well, particularly with Saar's case, I mean, she doesn't always use those things, right? And sometimes we think these things are authentic, and she's actually very slick about painting and, making things look old, making things look antique. But with that particular, one of her practice is basically, going to thrift shops or swap meets and things of that nature, and picking things up and using other people's materials. When her great aunt Hattie dies, her great aunt was like a grandmother to her, and her great aunt was a migrant from St. Louis, and she uses those things that basically, what to me is so fascinating, if these objects that I talk about in this book across the board somehow narrate Black migration, either through their materiality or through, context, intellect, thought, these works are actually, very much using materials of the Great Migration, things that people would have brought with them. In one of the works on paper, she actually has a letter that somebody sent her from her old hometown. So you already have that aspect of migration there. But in some cases, especially in the paper works and in some of these handkerchief collages, she does use photocopies. She does use Xerox, which is just coming into view, and people are calling it, wow, this is like an amazing new technology. It's basically a photocopy. But some of the actual three-dimensional objects, more than the letters itself, are these actual things. So that's why I was really fascinated by that. Other people who have used actual objects from family members are also a friend of Betty's, Marie Johnson Calloway, who is based in the Bay Area, who was very active there. And then also somebody like Edward Kienholz later, when his mother passes away, he uses some of her things as well. But by that time, that might be in the 90s, Betty has already been doing this. And so by the time Kienholz does it, nobody's worried about nostalgia, right, at that point. But famously, somebody like Rauschenberg does not use things with any kind of autobiographical or biographical ideas attached to it, because he wants to get rid of nostalgia, and he wants to just have it be about art and be about form and be objective and not have all the kind of baggage of history with it. So, but by the 90s, that's okay to have that.
Well, to answer your question specifically about the FBI files, so you might imagine that I received like a brown box, of files, but actually, so we requested the files almost 5 years ago. It took about 4 years for the Freedom of Information Act. I think they thought maybe we would get tired or give up, but we were very persistent and got the files back without planning to get them around the time of the 50th anniversary of the Black Panthers, which was interesting. But yeah, we received CDs with the FBI seal on it, and then hundreds of pages of PDFs, which has actually made it so that my father and my mother and I could all have the documents on our different computers in different cities and looking over it together as a family, which was interesting. So the files are reproductions. It's also, this sort of, I think there's a false idea that there really would be one original anyway, because many of the pages will be the same page but with different handwriting because it's been in different offices. So many things repeat, but you get this one's from the Boston office and this is from Cincinnati. I mean, the level of surveillance was so intense. There's so many hand, signatures and date stamps and official stamps that say things like racial interest section, which was something stamped on all these different pages. So there's this strange authority that they have, even though they're filled with lies, told by paid informants and provocateurs, but they have this truthiness to them because of the letterhead. But there are times when I will use actual objects that I think sometimes have this alchemy to them, or I think sometimes when I draw something that appears printed, and I know a lot of times not every audience member knows that it's a drawing, but just you might not know that the objects were personal to Betty Saar, but I do think that something is embedded there, even if you don't know.
And I think in the case of the FBI files, it's interesting because at once we have a paucity of archival history that an artist tries to recuperate, and then you have an excess of fake history that you kind of have to work against and mark against as the art object. So that's kind of the tension of Black life and its existence in the archive. In chapter 3, Organize, Building an Exhibitionary Complex, you write about the important ways Black artists made room for themselves within a context of discrimination, put plainly, that kept them out of mainstream institutions. Can you speak a little bit about the artistic landscape for Black artists during that time, what they were up against, and then how spaces like Gallery 32 and Brockman Gallery served as kind of redress for those?
Well, even in, we want to think about California as this kind of new place for art in general. We can talk about artists, Black artists in New York having a very long history, as art did. I mean, for those of you, anybody who's studied art history, when they talk about American art, it's almost always in New York. So California is really a new place for exhibiting. It doesn't have the same kind of histories as we see certainly on the East Coast. So even in a kind of general sense, a kind of wellspring of gallery activity begins happening in LA in the 50s. But up to that time, I'm not going to say there were no Black artists, but the people who were there, and I talk about some of them, Beulah Woodard is one of them, there's really no place to show. Once in a while you have people who do, 1 week shows. It's very exciting. They're always very popular, but there's really no place for them to show. Nobody's picking them up at these various venues. And then when the gallery activity begins to happen in LA, they're not picking up Black artists. Charles White moves there in 1956. He doesn't get a solo gallery show or representation until 1964. Because people are part of it is people could care less about a Black artist, and the other part is that he's doing figurative work, and we're thinking about, abstract expressionism. And his work really becomes more visible when pop becomes visible. You think of kind of pop beginning with showing Andy Warhol's soup cans in 1962 in LA. And so when you're starting to see these kind of figurative or representational things, then his work becomes more figurative. But there are really no places for black people to show. Even the black artists like Ed Burrell, who are hanging around with some of these more well-known galleries, he's basically hanging art for people. He's not shown, even though people know he's an artist. So people like the Dale and Alonzo Davis begin Brockman, Suzanne Jackson begins Gallery 32, and Samela Lewis begins like a million things, including galleries. She must have had 3 galleries. She had a museum. She starts a magazine. She writes a couple of books. She does film. And this is all to basically get these images out there. I mean, she's, pre-social media. She's basically doing social media, because she's doing this all across various media, actually. So, but these people are all artists, so they give up some of their time to do this. And we can put this in the same, thread as any kind of artist-run space or collectives that people start because they're being ignored or overlooked. But they, and these are not, well, I take it back. Brockman begins in 1967 and closes in 1992. I mean, it's quite amazing what they're able to do. But Suzanne Jackson's gallery is basically around for 2 years. And then she actually goes and starts working for Brockman at a certain point when they start doing a nonprofit thing. And some of these, Elizabeth Catlett, we were just talking about her at the We Wanted Revolution show over the weekend. Her big show, first show that she has in this country after 20 years is here at Studio Museum, right? 1971. But actually, the first show that she really has in this country is at Brockman Gallery. And actually, Alonzo Davis drives to Tijuana. She meets him there with the objects. You're talking about sculpture and prints, loads them into some kind of vehicle. And he drives them back to LA and shows them. If you look at the catalog for the Studio Museum Elizabeth Catlett show, which is on the wall right out here, you'll see most of the pieces are either from Brockman or from Catlett herself. These are the works that this man basically grabbed from Mexico. So, California keeps coming back into the picture. Maybe it's just me, but, so part of, this big thing for Elizabeth Catlett really starts with somebody driving, to Tijuana, him driving it back, and then it eventually getting here.
Sadie, could you tell us a little bit about the landscape in LA as you know it right now, as a bit of a comparison to the pioneering efforts that defined those decades? And is there a sense of a black artist community there or anything like that?
I think it's interesting, a lot of the same, physical spaces, even if they have different names, for the galleries, but the actual neighborhoods are still really important. So like Leimert Park or Crenshaw have been spaces that have been very important, in an art context, but also just in like social spaces where people go to be black together and like actively. Leimert Park is one of the only neighborhoods that's you have Little Tokyo and Chinatown, and Leimert Park is basically a black cultural hub. Yeah, a hub, but I mean it's sort of maybe underrepresented recognized or appreciated from the outside, but that's never really mattered. So it also feels very local, for lack of a better word. But yeah, I mean, it's there. It's I think, you know, reading about the history made it feel even more fought for and really intentional. I think California always has this sort of potential, which isn't always, it's not always delivered, but it's always, there's always room to try, I guess you could say. I think some of the things specifically about California, like the car culture, I noticed that cars came up often, and like, again, in this story, like driving down to Mexico to get artwork, like that kind of thing that's just possible, or, you know, finding a big warehouse space that's available, or, you know, like Senga Niguchi claiming this freeway space as a sort of sacred space, as freeways are pretty much sacred in LA, and then what's under the freeway is always this other layer. So I think, you know, those things are very California.
Thanks. Yeah, the freeway, that is great. Another thing that, well, in the Emerge chapter, you trace kind of the pioneers of the Black art world, those who basically set the standard for what a Black artist could be at a time when previously there weren't really those strong of examples. But another thing that comes out of this chapter is that there are a number of these aha moments that I referenced before, and South Pico is full of it. Read the book, and yeah, for me that's the case. But there are also these moments when it's clear that you've been taken by surprise by the archive. There are only a couple of moments where I really saw it in the writing. And one of them is when you were talking about a benefit for an assemblyman who was running for state senate, and you say that part of this benefit featured amazingly a tour of homes designed by Black architects. And I could tell that you found that particular archival find was really interesting to you. So can you talk to us about moments of the aha for you where you're just like, wow, this is a history that I couldn't have really imagined?
Well, I think that's why I like writing, and that's why I am interested in the archive, because there are always stories like that, you know? There are always stories like, your dad worked on the Angela Davis campaign, and so did Charles White, and so I think I love all those things, and, you know, finding out, you know, just, you know, this story about Elizabeth Catlett, knowing that the Brockman Gallery opens in 1967, and the Ferris Gallery, which is one of the, you know, the main thing we hear about for California art, you know, basically more white artists, no, you know, a few women, but no Black people showed there. But it closes in that year, and that's when the Black people open their gallery. Just by happenstance. So there's a lot of things, you know, interesting things that you find. Somebody like Samela Lewis, who I'd known about for years and know that she's started Black Art now, International Review of African American Art. You know, I always had a hard time tracking down how many galleries did she have? What was that? And finally, during the writing of the book, she gave her archive to Emory University. So I was so thankful, and went there, and I was able to answer some of the questions I had. But I think it's just, for me, I love all these stories that I find in the archive. My family may not love it because I tell them the stories over and over again. And but I just find it interesting because these people, you know, like Miriam Matthews, whose collection was just sold at Swan Galleries a few weeks back, you know, the first Black librarian. These people come to life for me. It's like my version of television. You know, they're living in my head, and I see them going around, you know, doing all these things. So I think the whole book for me is aha. That was, how many black architects? I mean, now we know David Adjaye, right? But who's going to build the new building for this place, which is going to be exciting. But how many black architects were there to feature in LA? Probably more than the Paul Revere Williams that we know about. So I just love hearing all those details, and I guess I'm just a child of these people because I really enjoy putting these stories back into circulation that are have been sublimated.
Sadie, can you talk about archival surprise in your own practice as an artist?
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a lot of surprises when going through this particular archive. I think really, just realizing how actively under attack my dad was. So his name was added to the 8X security list, which basically was an apprehension and detention program list, so he could be rounded up and detained without due process at any moment because he was considered a terrorist for organizing with, the Black Panthers free breakfast programs. By the time my dad was founding the Compton chapter, guns really weren't the primary focus of the party. He never carried a gun as a Black Panther. No one in his chapter ever did, but still the level of surveillance was such that they were considered terrorists. And just, for him, there's these personal surprise moments of, reading that they interviewed his high school teacher and teachers he might have not even remembered, or the little old lady next to where he grew up. So there's those moments almost of, oh, wow, Miss Murray, I forgot about her. And then you realize that, an FBI agent approached her to get this information. And then, of course, there's a lot of memories that he has of, agents breaking the door down with guns that aren't mentioned in the files. So, again, there's this sort of discrepancies there. But I think, there's also just the archive of the families, box of photos in my aunt's living room that no one ever goes through, and then I get to go through them. So my aunt and uncle, when they moved to Compton in 1952, they were the first Black family on the block, which is something, when reading through this history, the time and how LA is changing, literally Compton was all white, right? So they were the first Black family on the block in Compton, which, to think about what they've seen from 50s, 60s, 70s to 90s Compton is just sort of unbelievable. But I think that whole house to me is this archive, this treasure trove of lived histories.
Thank you. I guess I'll ask my last question, then we can open it up to audience questions, because I'm sure others would like a chance. This is a larger scope question, I admit, but I suppose that I think that we can begin to answer at least by the way of the particular. So in the last decade, there has been a spate of scholarship around the 1960s and 70s, much of which you cite in south of Pico. So Smethurst's The Black Arts Movement, Literary Nationalism in the 1960s and 70s, New Thoughts on the Black Arts Movement, edited by Lisa Gale Collins and Margot Natalie Crawford, for which you contributed a chapter. Margot Crawford's forthcoming book, I think next month, Black Post-Blackness, the Black Arts Movement in 21st Century Black Aesthetics. Jershan Avilas's Radical Aesthetics and Modern Black Nationalism. How might we understand this surge of interest in the 1960s, 70s, which is just another way of saying what brought you to this moment in LA, and then Sadie, what brought you to 1968 in particular?
Well, I think my interest, well, maybe growing up through that period is part of it, but I think part of my interest was when I graduated from college and came back to New York. And started working as a curator and started working here, one of the places I worked. These were the artists I met who had I later found out being in LA. It was David Hammonds, Maren Hassinger, Mel Edwards I had known for a long time. I met Senga Ngugi. So these were the people that I met here in New York. And later when I went to graduate school, I just continued working on some of these artists and then really got interested in this whole California thing, because what they, and if we use, as we always do, but Hammonds, for instance, as one example, of somebody who came from LA and then came here, what he did, looking back to see how he's really energized art in the late 20th century all over the world, where did that come from? It actually came from his experiences in California. And so as I looked into it, what became fascinating to me was how, California was much more open to multimedia. You can think of, the arts in New York, painting and sculpture. I mean, that begins to break down, but because California was already such a young place, in terms of, an art world, there were not as many rules. And so that's why you see people like Senga Ngugi, like Maren Hassinger, combining performance and sculpture and doing all these different things that might not have been as accepted initially here. Although, Linda Goodbryan is here, who takes these people in 1974 and begins showing them having this impact. But I think that kind of experimentation was much more available to them as artists on the West Coast. So it really, I think part of it is 60s and 70s, but mostly I was really inspired by the artists themselves and kind of getting to know them and then starting to delve into their histories more deeply.
I think 1968, it's such a pivotal year internationally and politically and musically and culturally. And to me, it's sort of epitomizes this generation gap from my generation to my dad's generation. So a lot of the work or the dialogue is sort of a love letter to 1968 or an apology or a lack of knowing exactly what to say or what to do with that history, but just sort of mulling it over, spending time, literally drawing time thinking about this. Maybe it's an attempt to sort of figure out where we've been, to figure out where we are, but it's not that straightforward. I think you talked about sort of queering the chronology and as a way of thinking about the future. I think it has something to do with that. It's almost like a time traveling. I think also, so that drawing maybe that you're referencing, which is Dear 1968, Love 1984, 1984 being the year I was born, but also I think a year that exists in people's imagination even before it arrives, right? So it's sort of like the promised future. It's like when, cars are going to be flying, but also it's like state surveillance in the Orwellian way. So I feel like both 1984 and 1968 are these sort of failed to live up to, we didn't have a revolution and we don't have the future, but it's not to say that we're unchanged by either of those years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if anybody in the audience has a question, please just shoot your hand in the air and I'll come bring you the microphone. Or a reflection. Okay.
Hi, thank you. This was really lovely for all three of you. This question is kind of just, Sadie, you mentioned the notion of California just kind of having this potentiality in the air. And I'm kind of just wondering how, I guess, any of you feel about the ways in which the transformation of space in California, just because it is this really expansive and open setting, how you feel that it is able to kind of manifest in the transformation like of the self, and how that kind of manifests in art, and if that is something that exists very differently on the West than in New York, for instance, and kind of how the idea of potential alters on both coasts just because of where these people are rooted and what's going on around them. Hard question, sorry.
Oh, I thought you were asking Sadie.
I mean, I think there's definitely something there. There is a breathing room that I see even in artist studios, in a way that maybe there's more solitude or less overlap, which, you know, I think has its ups and downs. But I do think that the space infuses the ideas and vice versa. I don't think it's just in our heads. You know, I don't know.
I mean, I would also say that, you know, people talked about this to me, and because we always think it's fake, you know, like, oh wow, California, really? Is that really it? But actually, they did have more space to have larger studios. I mean, also, you can make a parallel with places like Queens and hip hop, right? You have a lot of people who have basements and places where, you know, Run DMC and others, LL Cool J, can actually practice and, you know, make that kind of hip hop. But in California, you have more space to have galleries or exhibitions around a pool, like I show in one of my illustrations. So that is true. And also people went there, and I kept querying people because I just didn't want to believe that it was just because it was about this very kind of seemingly sappy notion of freedom. But many people told me, you know, that's why they were going there. They were going to free their minds. They were going to free their art. They were going to do that, and that was really something people sought there and they found there.
Hi, Dr. Jones. I just wanted to, my experience of Los Angeles has been that it's a place where the black population is both overstated and understated, because the percentage of black people in Los Angeles, like currently, is just under 10%, and that's much less than every other major city in the country that you would think of as an urban space. And at the same time, it's overrepresented in the imagination. So when people think of Los Angeles, and you know, when you see it represented in popular culture, there's a larger black presence than its numbers should allow at the same time. So it's a very strange city as far as blackness goes in comparison, you know, to Chicago, New York, Detroit, or other cities. Can you talk about that in terms of the artistic practice that developed from there?
Well, I didn't really have those numbers, but what I did know is that California becomes the endpoint of the Great Migration, right? So you have, and also if you look at maps of the Great Migration, you see people from the Carolinas sending their people to the East Coast, and I used to think that was something that was like a joke. It was something fantastic when somebody I would meet in New York say, "Oh yeah, my family's from South Carolina too." Really? Oh, my grandfather is from this town. Really? It's right next to this town. And I didn't know, you know, then later when you study this, yeah, that's called the Great Migration. This is how people ended up there. You know, people go, you know, from Georgia, they go up, or Alabama, they go up to Chicago, and then people like Mel Edwards go from Texas to LA. So part of it is that. Part of it is people went for jobs, mostly for freedom, but for jobs to LA, because you still have the last vestiges of the war industry sputtering out there in the aerospace communities. So there is a moment where, you know, people are going out there. What the numbers are specifically in relationship to other people, I'm not, I didn't do that research, but we also have to remember that, California was Mexico, things like that. So it wouldn't be surprising to say that black people were underrepresented, say, to Latinos in this country or in California. Of course, that wouldn't be surprising. But what would also be important to note is that when it was also a very diverse place, of course, you also have, a lot of Asian communities there and people who are migrating also from Japan to Hawaii to California as well. So you also have a Japanese migration coming in to LA. But even if you look at the turn of the century from the 19th into the 20th century, you see that as more black people came into school, for instance, they would start segregating them out. They wouldn't, if you got to have more than 10 people in a school or something like that, or in a classroom or in a grade, the white people would be able to leave that school and go to an all-white school. So, part of, yes, there may not be as many numbers as you would think would, warrant a kind of overrepresentation of culture, but the fact is that segregation, allows it to be a segregated and separate idea and cultural idea. And even though, again, there's no slavery in California, but there's still segregation, practices of segregation as well.
And I would just add, as a reflection, having grown up right next to the towers, that when you're talking about absolute numbers, that's just that 10% is a big number of people. And as Dr. Jones said, south of Pico is such a fabulous title because all those people lived in one neighborhood. And yet that neighborhood stretched for 15 miles. And so you could go 15 miles in those days and only see black people. And so it was amplified. And then so the culture reflected that, I think, as much as percentages of a metro.
And then I would just also add, sorry, Sadie, I would also add that the title really comes from the fact that Pio Pico, who's the last Mexican governor of California, is a person of African descent, right? So at a certain point, this is getting mixed in, and that's what I loved about finding out that phrase south of Pico, all black people live south of Pico. It's like saying the other side of the tracks, except it's in California, the other side of the California tracks. But then finding out that it's named after this person who was also, a hidden history of blackness, as I say, in that governor.
Just to speak to your point, I think segregation, how segregated LA still is, has a very, very important role in that. When I come to New York, I see everybody riding on the train together, and they might not all be renting in the same neighborhood, they might not all be, working in the same places, but they're next to each other on the train, whereas in California, you could be in Compton and not see a white person, for 2 weeks. And then you go to Silver Lake, my friends that live over there are like, oh, I gotta, come visit you, I miss black people, so it really, the segregation really does, organize the cultural activity in a different way, even today. And I think the title is so brilliant because everything in LA is organized by the freeways, the streets, and so to give a street the title really, really does speak to the way that LA operates.
Just to piggyback on the conversation of segregation, I'll point the question to you, Sadie. Do you feel that the role of galleries, like in Leimert Park, like Michelle Papillon's Papillon Gallery or Art in Practice, because of the segregation in LA, do you feel that they have a different function than maybe the cosmopolitan is not the right word, but the more crossover that happens here in New York with people on the subway and just communities that are kind of smashed up against each other? Do you feel galleries might have a different function or should have a different role because of that element in LA?
I think the galleries actually bring in a lot of different people, and I guess, their function is to show art and to sell art. I think the things that I, find most troubling or in need of attention due to segregation are more like the services that people are lacking. In recent years, people have been talking about the term food desert to describe places like South Central. So I think those are the things that I most feel the need for more options of in the neighborhood. But then you also have like Oakland, which is where I grew up, being gentrified so rapidly that when those services come into the neighborhood, then people who are there can't afford them anymore. So I really don't know what the answer is, and I haven't seen a model of it working much better.
But I would just add that Papillon and Art and Practice are basically in the same area. I think Papillon is actually in the Brockman space that Brockman had their galleries in for 22, 23 years, and they were actually able to get in there because of the Watts Rebellion and because these businesses were largely white-owned, and so then when Watts burned, people left, and the prices were cheap, and so people were able to get in there and get these spaces.
We probably have time for about 2 more questions, so if there's any more out there. Hi.
Hi. So I was curious, it hasn't come up yet, if like the idea of universities and the schools in Los Angeles, and I was curious for you, Professor Jones, if that came up in your research, sort of if universities had a role in the flourishing of Black artists in LA, then in the 1960s, and then for Sadie, you mentioned CalArts at the beginning, like how you see universities playing a role now in the art scene in LA.
Well, I think some of these artists actually were veterans of the Korean War, and so they had the GI Bill, and they were able to go to school. And beyond that, you can see certainly UCLA being really important, certainly for film, and visual communications was a Asian film collective run by Bob Nakamura, or one of the co-founders, who also, was involved taking pictures of some of these artists. UCLA also, previous to the Hammer Museum, right? The gallery there was supporting African American artists as well. You had the Fowler, which had always done, they all had like a million different names, which I'm forgetting them all, but had done shows of African art, for instance, and so people could see things. And then you had Los Angeles Community College. Kazuko Iga was an artist teaching there, father of the late curator Karen Higa, and he did an important show of, I think it was called Black Art in LA, which we also featured in Now Dig This, the images, and Karen Higa wrote a beautiful article about his support of artists, Black artists at that time, as somebody who had been through Japanese internment, and the kind of what he felt for those artists. And a lot of these people are going to LACC, David Hammonds, Del and Alonzo Davis, a lot of people went through there. So I think particularly the community colleges, well, basically all colleges actually, on whether it's the community college level or the state university or the university level. The California system is so important and so wide-ranging that I think it really had a lot of support for artists. Samela Lewis ended up teaching at Dominguez Hills, so did John Otterbridge. So there's a lot of ways, I think there's through exhibition, through actually going to school, and through teaching that the California educational system really did support these artists in a myriad of ways.
Can I just quickly add, of course, there's Charles White, who spends many years teaching at Otis and is where David Hammondsby seeks him out as a teacher and serves as a mentor for an entire generation, including Kerry James Marshall, et cetera. So that's another institutional space that's crucial.
And of course, Cal Arts, but we'll let Sadie talk about the Cal Arts piece.
I mean, yeah, I mentioned Cal Arts because of how often it came up, although mostly in south of Pico, it's referred to as Chenard, which was the predecessor to California Institute of the Arts. I mean, huge. I think Cal Arts is one of those spaces that's, even within the context of California, it's in this separate town that's about 20 miles, 15 miles north of LA. So it really exists in this, like they call it the castle on the hill. It really is this space of experimentation, a space that is outside of even like a lot of law enforcement. So like growing up in Oakland where, you always knew that the cops were just like hearing distance away, to be at Cal Arts, which is really like up on this hill and not heavily policed. There was a lot of experimentation, art and otherwise, that goes on there, and just sort of might seem like, this like hippie idea, but really when you look at the artists that are coming out of there, it starts to look much more like an intentional, like pedagogy decision.
Okay, last call. Question. Is that a hand? No. Okay. No? Okay. Well, on that note, thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Jones, Sadie, and Ashley.